Box FM with fear.
He knows the rules now. He understands the compromise. He gives the nightmare its inch, and in return, the nightmare allows him to live. But sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, when the wind howls through the ancient oaks outside and the house settles with a deep, echoing groan, Andrew lies awake in his bed upstairs. He listens closely to the kitchen hallway. And on those nights, he swears he can hear the sound of the door hinges creaking, just a fraction of a millimeter wider, as if the thing down below is slowly, patiently testing his boundaries, waiting for the day when an inch is no longer enough to satisfy its hunger. Thank you for tuning into Horror Box FM, episode 12. If you are listening to this late at night, we appreciate your bravery. Before you close your eyes tonight, take a walk through your house. Check your windows, check your back doors, and make sure your deadbolts are thrown tight. But if you come across a door that refuses to stay shut, if you find a lock that turns on its own, do not force it. Some doors are meant to stay unlocked. Good night, listeners, and stay safe out there in the dark. It stopped. Exactly 1 inch open. A soft, ice-cold draft blew through the narrow crack, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable aroma of ancient earth, ozone, and the distant, rhythmic sound of a massive inhalation. Asterisk inhale. Exhale, asterisk followed by a low, vibrating, satisfied hiss that echoed in Andrew's mind rather than his ears. The caretaker. 2 years have passed since that horrific afternoon. Andrew still lives in the Vance Estate outside Blackwood. He cannot sell the property. No building inspector will clear the structure due to the anomalous structural shifts in the foundation, and any potential buyer who steps into the kitchen is immediately overcome by a primal, instinctive urge to run away. But truth be told, Andrew has stopped trying to leave. He has accepted his reality. He has stopped buying locks. He has stopped installing deadbolts, chains, or barricades. He understands now that he does not own this house. He is merely a tenant, a small, fragile creature living on top of an ancient, sleeping god. Every single night, before the clock strikes 12, Andrew walks down the dim kitchen hallway. He carries a small flashlight, not to explore, but to inspect the threshold. He ensures that the basement door is open by exactly 1 inch. No more, no less. He meticulously cleans the dust away from the crack. He ensures that no furniture, rugs, or household items obstruct the thin, freezing draft that constantly emanates from the dark. He listens to the heavy, rhythmic breathing that rises from the earth, a sound that has now become a twisted, horrifying lullaby that helps him sleep. Another impact, louder than the first. The high-tech digital smart lock shattered under the sheer force, its plastic casing exploding into a dozen pieces, the internal steel gears shearing off and clattering across the floor. The antique iron latch bent at an impossible angle. The heavy security chain snapped like a piece of thread. Andrew collapsed onto his hands and knees, backing away until his spine hit the kitchen cabinets. He watched in horror as the center of the thick, historic door splintered slightly, bending inward like cardboard under the grip of an invisible vice. The air pressure in the kitchen dropped instantly. Andrew's ears popped painfully, and a high-pitched, deafening ringing filled his head. The glass panes of the kitchen windows began to spiderweb with cracks, the pressure building within the sealed house exactly as his uncle had warned. The air became thin, hot, and suffocating. He couldn't breathe. He was going to die, crushed by the atmospheric vacuum of the house or consumed by the nightmare below. In a final, desperate act of survival, remembering the exact words written in his uncle's diary, Andrew screamed at the top of his lungs over the sound of the splintering wood. "Stop! Stop! I'll let it open. I will not lock it." The pounding ceased instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. The immense pressure in the room vanished in a fraction of a second, causing the air to rush back into Andrew's lungs so violently that he coughed and gagged. Slowly, agonizingly, the bent iron latch slid back on its own, scraping against the ruined wood. The shattered remnants of the smart lock clicked. The heavy oak door, now scarred and cracked down the center, creaked on its strained hinges. It slowly moved outward, away from the frame, shifting through the ruined barricade of the table. The shifting mass of teeth surged forward, a tendril of black slime lashing out toward Andrew's foot. The spell of paralysis broke. Andrew screamed, dropped his dead camera, turned on his heel, and bolted up the dirt slope. The breaking of the threshold. He ran blindly through the pitch-black cavern, guided only by the dim, failing light of his headlamp. Behind him, he could hear the entity moving with terrifying, unnatural speed. It didn't sound like footsteps, it sounded like a tidal wave of liquid rushing over rocks, accompanied by the deafening, rhythmic roar of its massive breathing and the incessant, metallic grinding of its millions of teeth. Andrew scrambled up the final slope, his hands slipping on the damp dirt, tearing his fingernails on rocks. He reached the wooden basement stairs and practically threw himself up them, taking them 3 at a time. The wood groaned and cracked under the sudden force, the structure shaking as if an earthquake was hitting the estate. He burst into the kitchen hallway, spun around, and violently slammed the heavy oak door shut. In a panic-fueled frenzy, he engaged the digital smart lock, turned the manual iron latch, threw a heavy security chain he had recently installed, and dragged a heavy, solid oak dining table across the kitchen floor, wedging it firmly against the door frame. He backed away, gasping for air, his chest heaving, tears of pure terror streaming down his face. For a single, agonizing second, there was absolute silence. Then, the entire house shook. Boom. Something of immense, unimaginable weight threw itself against the other side of the basement door. The solid oak wood bowed inward, the grain screaming under the pressure. The heavy dining table Andrew had used as a barricade skidded back a few inches across the linoleum floor. Then, the breathing started. It didn't come from around him, it came directly from the black void within the stone archway. It was incredibly loud now, a deep, wet, rattling respiration that echoed off the cavern walls. With every exhale, a wave of freezing, foul-smelling air washed over Andrew, carrying the stench of decaying flesh and ancient, turned earth. Andrew stood paralyzed by fear as the darkness within the archway began to move. It wasn't a shadow cast by light, it was a physical, fluid mass of darkness, undulating and flowing forward like crude oil. It poured over the edge of the stone threshold, creeping along the dirt floor toward him. And within that shifting, formless mass, hundreds of tiny, pale white points of light began to manifest. Andrew zoomed his eyes in, his vision adapting to the dim light. They weren't eyes. They were teeth. Millions of tiny, needle-sharp, translucent teeth arranged in endless, concentric circles, shifting, grinding, and snapping against one another with a horrific sound that sounded like glass being crushed in a meat grinder. The entity wasn't just a monster, it was a living, breathing mouth, an endless throat stretching down into the deepest, darkest depths of the planet. The realization hit Andrew with the force of a physical blow. His uncle's journal was completely literal. This entity was an ancient, planetary anomaly, an apex consumer that required the ventilation of the surface world to sustain its slumber. He was no longer just under his house. He was entering a subterranean cavern system. The dirt floor sloped sharply downward, drawing him deeper into the earth. Andrew followed the slope, his heart hammering in his chest, the camera recording every step. The silence down here was absolute, thick, and deafening, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the loose gravel. At the lowest point of the slope, about 50 yards into the cavern, the flashlight beam illuminated a structure that made Andrew stop dead in his tracks. It was a doorway. But it wasn't made of wood or brick. It was a massive, arching frame constructed from large blocks of an unknown, jet-black stone that seemed to absorb the very light of his flashlight. The stone was completely smooth, devoid of any tool marks, but carved into its surface were intricate, geometric patterns that didn't resemble any known human culture. When Andrew stared at the patterns, a sharp, stabbing pain flared behind his eyes, forcing him to look away. There was no actual door within the stone frame, only a void of absolute, pitch-black darkness that felt physical, like a solid wall of night. As Andrew stood before the archway, a sudden, violent vibration ran through the ground beneath his feet. The high-powered tactical flashlight in his hand began to flicker erratically. The battery indicator dropped from full to empty in a matter of seconds. The digital camera in his other hand glitched, the screen filling with green static before dying completely. Descent into the abyss. Andrew returned to the estate late that afternoon as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody red shadows through the trees. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the basement door. As always, it was open by exactly 1 inch. He knew he couldn't live like this, trapped in a cycle of fear, paralyzed by an unknown entity beneath his feet. He was a man of logic, or at least, he used to be. If there was an ancient anomaly beneath his house, he needed to see it with his own eyes during the daylight. He needed to know what he was truly up against. Andrew prepared himself. He put on heavy boots, grabbed his highest-powered tactical flashlight, a headlamp, and a digital video camera to record whatever he found. He walked to the end of the hallway. He placed his hand on the cold wood of the basement door and pushed it wide open. The hinges shrieked in protest, a sound that seemed to echo down into an infinite void. He stepped over the threshold and began his descent down the creaking wooden stairs. The basement was massive, far larger than the actual footprint of the house above suggested. The air down here was thick, heavy, and freezing, carrying an overpowering stench of stagnant water, ozone, and an ancient, metallic odor that smelled like dried blood and rusted iron. He turned on his flashlight, the powerful beam cutting through the heavy dust motes. The front section of the basement was filled with typical storage, old trunks, broken Victorian furniture, and stacks of his uncle's academic papers rotting away in the extreme humidity. But as Andrew moved deeper, past the brick support pillars, he noticed that the concrete floor gave way to rough, uneven, damp dirt. The ceiling of the basement seemed to recede, rising higher into darkness until he could no longer see the wooden floorboards of the kitchen above. November 4, 2012. The threshold cannot be closed. I have tried welding the iron latch. I have tried bracing the door with solid timber. By morning, the welds are cracked like glass, and the timbers are splintered into toothpicks. It does not want to escape. It does not want to come up. It wants to breathe. The basement is not a room, it is a pulmonary valve for something deep beneath the mountain. If I seal it completely, the pressure in the house builds. The walls groan, the windows shatter, and the air becomes thin enough to suffocate a man. It must have its inch. It must taste the air of the world above, asterisk. Andrew stared at the fading ink, a heavy, suffocating dread settling deep into his stomach. His uncle hadn't been a madman hiding from the world. He had been a warden. A man surviving a nightmare by making a terrible compromise. Another entry from a month later read, December 18, 2012. I saw it tonight in the crack. Millions of them. Not eyes. Teeth. It is a mouth that goes down into the infinite. I cannot leave this house. If I leave, and the door shuts permanently, the pressure will rupture the earth. I must stay. I must keep the threshold clear. May God have mercy on whoever inherits this burden. Andrew closed the diary, his hands cold. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming a picture so terrifying that his logical mind desperately tried to reject it. But he knew what he had heard the night before. He knew the breathing was real. The academic's madness. The next morning, exhausted and consumed by a growing sense of dread, Andrew realized that he was dealing with something far beyond a mechanical issue or a simple intruder. He needed to understand the history of this house, and more importantly, what his granduncle Arthur had been doing here before his mysterious death. Andrew drove into the town of Blackwood, heading straight for the local historical society, a small, dusty archive housed in the basement of the town library, run by an elderly volunteer named Evelyn. After hours of digging through old town records, property deeds, and local newspaper microfilms, Andrew found very little about the house itself, other than it was built on land that had been avoided by early settlers. However, Evelyn brought out a cardboard box containing personal effects and journals that had been cleared out from Arthur Vance's office after he passed away, donated to the society by the estate executors. Among the papers, Andrew found a leather-bound diary belonging to his granduncle. The dates spanned from 1995 to 2014. Andrew sat at a wooden desk in the corner of the archive and began to read. The handwriting in the early years was precise, elegant, and academic. Arthur was a professor of anthropology and archaeology, and his notes detailed his research into local Native American folklore, specifically pre-colonial myths regarding the breathing earth, and spaces that the indigenous tribes deemed forbidden. But as the journal entries progressed into the late 2000s, the handwriting began to deteriorate. The lines grew erratic, slanted, and chaotic. The precise academic language devolved into frantic, fearful rants. Andrew flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the manic scrawl, until he hit a series of entries from the winter of 2012. He walked down the stairs, each step sounding like a gunshot in the dead of night. He turned the corner into the kitchen, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, painting long shadows on the walls. He aimed the beam down the hallway. The basement door was open. Exactly 1 inch. Andrew opened his phone app to look at the access logs, expecting to see a software glitch or a system error. What he saw made his blood run completely cold. The log didn't say unlocked by user, nor did it show a passcode entry. It simply read, hardware override, manual. But nobody was in the house except him. Andrew walked up to the door, his hands trembling so violently he could barely keep the flashlight steady. He shone the light into the narrow, 1-inch crack. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the top few wooden steps leading down into the basement. The wood looked strangely wet, glistening in the light. Suddenly, a sound drifted up from the pitch-black depths. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't the scurrying of rats or the shifting of old foundations. It was the sound of a rhythmic, wet, heavy breathing. Asterisk inhale. Exhale, asterisk. It sounded massive, like the lungs of a creature far too large to fit in any basement, breathing in perfect, terrifying sync with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. Terrified, Andrew slammed the door shut with all his weight, held it, and watched the digital lock automatically engage, shooting the steel bolt into the frame. He ran back upstairs, locked his bedroom door, and turned on every single light in the room. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. Marcus shrugged, looking uncomfortable. Tell you what. We'll replace the whole damn thing. I've got a commercial-grade digital smart lock in the truck. Heavy steel, automated latch, and it connects to your phone via Bluetooth. It logs every single interaction. If the door opens, your phone will tell you exactly what time and how it happened. Andrew eagerly agreed, paying the premium price for peace of mind. By evening, the high-tech digital lock was installed, casting a cold, blue LED glow against the ancient wood of the door. Marcus left, advising Andrew to keep his phone close. That night, Andrew kept his phone on his nightstand, the volume turned up to maximum. He lay awake for hours, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, listening to the wind howl through the trees outside. The digital clock on his bedside table ticked away the hours: 12 a.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m. At exactly 3:14 a.m., his phone vibrated violently against the wood of the nightstand. A sharp, piercing notification tone shattered the silence of the bedroom. Andrew snatched the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. The screen illuminated his face, displaying a single alert from the lock application: basement door, unlocked. Adrenaline surging through his veins, Andrew grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight and an aluminum baseball bat from the closet. He stepped out onto the hallway landing. The air in the house had plummeted to near-freezing temperatures. His breath plumed in thick, white clouds before him, which was impossible since the central heating was humming away, set to 70 degrees. The creeping shadow. By the end of the second week, what had begun as an annoying architectural flaw transformed into a psychological anchor. Andrew began to feel a profound shift in the atmosphere of the estate. The air inside the house grew progressively heavier, colder, and more draining. It wasn't just a drop in temperature, it felt dense, as if the air itself was resisting his movements, making every step from room to room feel like wading through water. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful, it was expectant. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the support beams felt intentional. Determined to solve the mystery and regain his peace of mind, Andrew decided to seek professional help. He called a local locksmith, a gruff alderman named Marcus who had worked in the Blackwood area for over 40 years and knew the old estates better than anyone. When Marcus arrived, he looked at the house with a strange, hesitant expression, but said nothing. Andrew led him down the kitchen hallway to the basement door. Marcus spent over 2 hours meticulously examining the door, the hinges, the frame, and the lock mechanism. He used levels, checked the alignment, and dismantled the old deadbolt. "There's nothing wrong with this frame, son," Marcus said, scratching his gray beard, looking genuinely baffled. "The wood isn't warped. In fact, this oak is so seasoned it's hard as rock. The door shouldn't be able to move a millimeter when that bolt is thrown. Then how is it opening every night without breaking the lock?" Andrew asked, his voice tinged with frustration. The basement door was ajar. Just an inch. A thin line of pitch-black shadow sliced through the warm morning light of the kitchen. Andrew frowned, a slight chill prickling his neck. He walked over, examining the lock. The deadbolt was still extended in the locked position, but it was jutting out into empty air. The door frame itself seemed completely unscathed. There were no signs of forced entry, no splintered wood, no scratch marks. The door had simply bypassed the frame, opening without retracting the bolt. Must be a badly warped frame, Andrew reasoned, trying to shake off the sudden unease. Old houses settle over a century. The wood expands and contracts with the autumn humidity. He pulled the door shut, retracted the deadbolt, closed it completely, and locked it again. He gave it 3 hard tugs with his full body weight. It held fast. Satisfied that it was just a mechanical quirk of an aging house, he went about his day, typing away at his manuscript in the study. But the next night, the cycle repeated. And the night after that. No matter how hard he turned the key, no matter how many times he verified that the deadbolt was deeply embedded into the strike plate, every single morning he would wake up to find the door resting exactly 1 inch open. It didn't matter if he stayed up until 2 a.m. checking it. By 6 a.m., the lock would be bypassed, and the door would be waiting for him, a silent, gaping mouth leading down into the dark earth. When Andrew first arrived in the autumn, the air was already biting. The estate was breathtakingly beautiful but carried an undeniable atmospheric weight. It felt as though the house was constantly holding its breath, waiting for something to disrupt its stagnant peace. Andrew, a freelance writer looking for solitude to finish his book, thought he had found the perfect sanctuary. He was wrong. As Andrew settled in during those first few days, he began to notice the peculiarities of the structure. The most prominent of these was the basement door. Situated at the far end of the long, narrow kitchen hallway, the door was unusually heavy, crafted from thick, solid oak and reinforced with an antique iron latch. Above the latch sat a modern, heavy-duty deadbolt that his uncle had installed later in life, looking entirely out of place against the weathered wood. On his very first night, while doing a routine sweep of the house before bed, Andrew turned the knob of the basement door. To his surprise, it swung open with a low, agonizing groan. The darkness beyond was absolute, smelling faintly of damp earth, old copper, and stagnant water. Left it open, Andrew muttered to himself, assuming the movers or the real estate agent had been down there. He closed the heavy door firmly, threw the deadbolt until he heard a satisfying, metallic clack, and went upstairs to sleep. The next morning, Andrew walked into the kitchen to brew his morning coffee. As he waited for the water to heat, his eyes drifted down the dim hallway. Welcome back to Horror Box FM. This is episode 12. If you are joining us for the first time, turn down your lights, lock your doors, and put on your headphones. Tonight's broadcast is not for the faint of heart. We are diving into a sprawling, terrifying, and deeply mysterious account sent to us by a listener named Andrew. This is a story that unfolds over months, a slow-burning descent into absolute psychological horror that challenges everything we know about security, reality, and the ancient things that hide beneath the earth. We often believe that our homes are our sanctuaries, that four walls, a roof, and a sturdy deadbolt can keep the world's anomalies outside. But what happens when the anomaly is already woven into the very foundation of the house itself? For the next 40 minutes, I ask you to sit back, let the darkness envelope you, and listen closely to a chronicle of terror that Andrew titled, "The Basement Door is Always Unlocked." The house was located just outside the sleepy, heavily forested town of Blackwood, nestled deep within an isolated perimeter of ancient oaks and weeping willows in upstate New York. Built in the late 1920s, it possessed that heavy, imposing architecture of a bygone era, dark mahogany trim, high ceilings that swallowed sound, and a sprawling layout that felt far too large for a single run. Andrew had inherited the property from his late granduncle, Arthur Vance, a reclusive academic who had lived out his final decades in absolute, paranoid isolation.
Horrorbox FM with fear.